From Crazy 8 almost killing him with a broken plate shard, to the cousins breaking into his house. As a meth cook, Walter White put himself into many situations where he almost got killed. In this video, I'm going to cover the 9 incidents throughout the 5 seasons of the show in which Walter White almost died. In the pilot, Walter nearly died at the hands of drug dealers Crazy 8 and Emilio when his first meth deal went catastrophically wrong, forcing him to commit his first murder to survive. Walt had recently been diagnosed with terminal lung cancer and desperately needed money for his family after his death. When he discovered the former student Jesse Pinkman was cooking meth, Walt blackmailed him into partnership, believing his superior chemistry knowledge would create a better product. They arranged to sell their first batch to Crazy 8, a local distributor in the remote New Mexico desert, using Jesse's RV as a mobile lab. Walt thought that this would be a simple business transaction, but he severely underestimated the violent world he was entering. The deal immediately went wrong when Emilio recognized Walt from a recent DEA raid, where he had been riding along with his brother-in-law Hank.
Hey, I know you. He was there when I got busted. He's with the DEA.
Convinced that Walt was an undercover cop, the dealers drew their guns and demanded answers. Walt frantically tried to explain that he was just a high school teacher, but Crazy 8 and Emilio weren't buying his story. They forced him to cook meth at gunpoint to prove he wasn't law enforcement, planning to kill him afterwards regardless. Trapped inside the RV with no escape route, Walt used his chemistry knowledge as a weapon. The dealers watched suspiciously as Walt worked, guns trained on him, completely unaware that he was creating a chemical weapon. He created phosphine gas, a colorless, toxic vapor, by combining red phosphorus with hydrophosphorus acid, filling the confined space with deadly fumes. Crazy 8 and Emilio began choking and gasping as the poisonous fumes overwhelmed them, their gunshots slowing down as they collapsed to the floor, while Walt and an unconscious Jesse escaped wearing gas masks. Walt's quick thinking saved their lives, but the experience traumatized him. He had gone from suburban teacher to double murderer in a single afternoon, crossing a line he could never uncross. This wasn't the only near-death experience in the pilot episode though. After Walt had killed Emilio and injured Crazy 8 with the phosphine gas, he and an unconscious Jesse were stranded in the desert when their RV broke down. Walt was completely out of his element. A mild-mannered high school chemistry teacher who had just committed double murder was now facing the reality of what he'd done. As police sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer to their location, Walt's panic reached a breaking point. He believed capture was inevitable and couldn't face the shame of being arrested as a meth cook and murderer. The sound of approaching law enforcement grew louder, and Walt knew he only had minutes before they would be discovered. His family would learn the truth about his criminal activities, destroying their memory of him forever. Walt picked up Crazy 8's gun from the RV floor, his hands trembling as he pointed the barrel at his own head. With the sirens growing closer and his life spiraling completely out of control, he made the decision to end everything rather than face arrest and public humiliation. Walt pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The gun's safety was still engaged, and he had no idea how to disengage it. The failed suicide attempt forced Walt to face his new reality. As he fumbled desperately with the safety mechanism, the sirens passed by without stopping, revealing they weren't coming for him after all. Walt lowered the gun, realizing that fate had intervened to keep him alive for whatever came next in his criminal journey. You'd think after almost dying twice in the span of about 20 minutes, Walter would have decided to stop his criminal activities, but as we've seen, that was far from happening. In the 3rd episode of season 1, Walt almost died when he discovered that Crazy 8 had secretly armed himself with a broken plate shard while chained in Jesse's basement, planning to kill Walt the moment he was freed. After the RV incident, Walt and Jesse had captured Crazy 8 alive and chained him to a support beam in Jesse's basement while they decided what to do with him. Walt was struggling with the moral dilemma of killing another human being, even a dangerous drug dealer who would certainly seek revenge if released. Over several days, Walt brought Crazy 8 food and engaged in conversation, desperately searching for any reason to spare his life. He even made a pros and cons list about keeping Crazy 8 alive, with only one item in the cons column: he'll kill your entire family. Walt's internal conflict deepened as he began to see Crazy 8 as a human being rather than just a threat. During their conversation, Crazy 8 seemed reasonable and even grateful for Walt's kindness. Walt started to believe that maybe he could release Crazy 8 without consequences, that perhaps the dealer would simply disappear and leave them alone. The possibility of avoiding another murder gave Walt hope that he could step back from the darkness he entered. Everything changed when Walt had a brief fainting spell, accidentally breaking a plate while bringing bringing Crazy 8 a sandwich. When Walt regained consciousness and continued their conversation, Crazy 8 seemed increasingly cooperative, even offering advice about Walt's family situation. However, when Walt went upstairs to clean up the pieces and get the key to unlock the chains, he noticed that one large sharp piece of the plate was missing. The horrifying realization hit Walt like a physical blow. Crazy 8 had been playing him the entire time. The dealer had pocketed the plate shard during Walt's fainting episode and was planning to use it as a weapon the moment that Walt freed him. All their conversations, all of Crazy 8's apparent gratitude and cooperation had been an elaborate deception to lure Walt into a false sense of security.
Doing the right thing, Walter.
Walt understood that if he had followed through with his plan to release Crazy 8, he would have been stabbed to death the instant the chains came off. Walt returned to the basement and strangled Crazy 8 with a bike lock chain, ending both the threat and his own innocence forever. When watching this for the first time, I knew I was in for one hell of a ride. Subscribe if you thought the same. Another time Walter White almost died was when he detonated fulminated mercury inside Tuco Salamanca's headquarters. After Tuco brutally beat Jesse and stole their meth without payment, Walt found himself facing a psychopathic drug dealer who had already proven his willingness to use extreme violence. Jesse was hospitalized with broken ribs, and Walt knew that approaching Tuco alone was essentially a suicide mission. However, Walt was desperate to recover their money and establish respect in the drug trade, believing that showing weakness to Tuco would mean certain death for both him and Jesse in the future. Walt's plan was audacious and terrifying. He would use chemistry as a weapon to intimidate Tuco into paying what he owed. Walt synthesized fulminated mercury, an extremely unstable explosive compound that could detonate from the slightest impact or friction. He disguised the deadly chemical as meth crystals, knowing that Tuco's violent nature and short temper would make the confrontation incredibly dangerous. One wrong move, one moment of lost control, and the explosion would kill everyone in the room. When Walt arrived at Tuco's office as Heisenberg, he calmly demanded $50,000, payment for the stolen meth plus compensation for Jesse's injuries. Tuco laughed and refused, believing this mild-mannered man posed no threat. Walt then picked up a small crystal of what Tuco thought was meth and hurled it at the floor.
You got one part of that wrong. This is not meth.
The explosion was devastating, blowing out windows and destroying the upper floor of the building while Tuco's men dove for cover. Walt stood in the smoking wreckage holding a bag of the same explosive crystals, threatening to throw the entire bag if Tuco didn't pay immediately. The explosion had been so powerful that Walt himself was lucky to survive the blast, and carrying more fulminated mercury meant that he was essentially holding a bomb that could kill them all. Tuco, genuinely impressed by Walt's balls, immediately agreed to pay and establish an ongoing business relationship. Walt had successfully used controlled violence to earn respect, but he had also come within inches of accidentally killing himself with his own chemical weapon. Although the way the building had exploded, and yet Walter only leaving with a bleeding nose, was quite unrealistic, it still made for a really entertaining scene in my opinion. This isn't the first time that Walt nearly died with Tuco present. Walt and Jesse nearly got killed at Tuco's remote desert hideout when their attempt to poison him backfired, leading to a violent confrontation that almost cost them their lives. After witnessing Tuco beat No-Dos to death in a meth-fueled rage, Walt and Jesse realized that they were dealing with an unpredictable psychopath who could kill them at any moment. When Tuco kidnapped them at gunpoint and forced them to his desert shack to meet his cousins from Mexico, Walt and Jesse knew that they were running out of time. Tuco planned to take them to a cartel super lab where they would cook meth as prisoners, essentially ending their freedom forever. Their only hope was the rich poison Walt had prepared, disguised as a small bag of meth that they planned to trick Tuco into snorting. The situation grew more desperate when they discovered Tuco was caring for his wheelchair-bound uncle, Hector, who could communicate by ringing a bell. Walt and Jesse attempted to poison Tuco during breakfast, but their plan failed when Jesse mentioned the meth contained chili powder, which Tuco hated. Later, Walt tried to slip ricin in Tuco's burrito, but Hector's bell ringing alerted Tuco to the danger just before he could eat the poisoned food. When Hector finally communicated that Walt and Jesse were punking Tuco, the drug dealer's paranoid rage exploded. Tuco grabbed Jesse and dragged him outside while pointing an assault rifle at Walt to keep him back. In the desert behind the shack, Tuco began brutally beating Jesse while Walt watched helplessly, knowing that Tuco's violent outbursts could easily turn fatal. The psychotic dealer was high on meth and completely unpredictable, swinging between moments of casual conversation and explosive violence. At any second, Tuco could have killed both of them. The confrontation reached its climax when Jesse Jesse managed to grab a rock and strike Tuco in the head, causing him to drop his rifle. Walt seized the weapon, but couldn't get a clear shot as Tuco and Jesse fought hand to hand in the dirt. Tuco gained the upper hand and began choking Jesse to death, but Jesse reached Tuco's pistol and shot him in the stomach. Just as they thought they had escaped, Hank Schrader arrived searching for Jesse and engaged Tuco in a final shootout, killing the dealer but leaving Walt and Jesse to flee into the desert. In the next season, Walt came within minutes of being murdered in his own home when the Salamanca cousins, Marco and Lionel, infiltrated his house with an axe while he showered, completely unaware of the imminent threat. The twin assassins had traveled from Mexico to Albuquerque on a mission of vengeance for their cousin Tuco's death. Using Hector Salamanca's Ouija board communication, they had learned that Heisenberg, the man responsible for Tuco's demise, was actually Walter White. Armed with Walter's home address and their signature silver-tipped axe, the cousins planned to execute him in the most brutal way possible. Their reputation as cartel killers preceded them. They were known for their methodical, silent approach to murder and their preference for medieval weapons over guns. Mike Ehrmantraut had been conducting surveillance on Walt's house when he spotted the cousins' car pulling up to the residence. The twins moved with deadly precision, dressed in their matching gray suits and polished shoes, approaching the house like grim reapers. Mike immediately understood the gravity of the situation. These weren't ordinary criminals, but professional killers sent by the cartel to settle a blood debt. Inside the house, Walt was completely oblivious to the danger as he took a relaxing shower. The sound of running water masked any noise the intruder might have made as they silently entered his home. The cousins moved through the house with their axe ready, systematically checking rooms as they hunted for their target. They eventually found Walt's bedroom and sat on his bed, waiting patiently for him to emerge from the bathroom so that they could complete their execution. At the last possible moment, Mike made a crucial phone call to Gus Fring's operation, and the cousins received a text message reading simply Pollos. Understanding this as a direct order from higher cartel authority, they immediately abandoned their mission and left the house as silently as they had entered. Walt finished his shower completely unaware that he had been seconds away from being brutally murdered by two of the cartel's most feared assassins, saved only by Gus Fring's intervention. Although Mike had saved Walt in this situation, I can't say the same about this next near-death experience. In one of the most tense scenes of the whole show, Walt came dangerously close to death when Mike held him at gunpoint in the lab, with orders from Gus Fring to kill him for his reckless interference in the drug operation. Walt's situation had deteriorated rapidly after he had killed Gus's dealers to save Jesse from certain death. This act of defiance against Gus's carefully orchestrated business had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Gus had been planning to replace Walt with Gail Bedecker anyway, but Walt's violent intervention forced Gus to accelerate his timeline. With Jesse now a fugitive and Walt having directly challenged his authority, Gus decided that both partners had become too dangerous to keep alive. The methodical drug kingpin had built his empire on discipline and control, and Walt's unpredictable actions threatened everything. As Walt walked outside to drive to Gail's house, he was stopped by Victor, claiming that there was a chemical leak at the lab that required his immediate attention. With no other option, he drove with Victor to the laundromat facility, but the moment he arrived, he realized it was a trap. Mike was waiting for him, both men armed and clearly there on Gus's orders. The sterile lab that had been Walt's sanctuary now felt like a tomb as he faced the two enforcers. Mike calmly informed Walt that this was the end of the line, his hand steady on his weapon as he prepared to execute Gus's judgment. Walt, desperate and panicked, tried every possible angle to save his life. He offered to work for free, promised to cook better meth, and begged for mercy, but Mike remained unmoved.
I'll cook. I'll cook for free, and there won't be any more trouble, I promise you. Okay, if I could just talk to Gus. I know I can make him understand, please. If I could talk to Gus, I can convince him, okay? Just let me, please let me talk to him. Shut up! Shut up.
The former police officer had carried out executions before and showed no emotion as he prepared to add Walt to the list of his victims. In a final desperate gambit, Walt offered up Jesse's location in exchange for his own life, then used the phone call to warn Jesse that he needed to kill Gail immediately. This brilliant manipulation turned the tables on Gus's plan. Without Gail, Gus couldn't afford to kill his only remaining chemist. Walt's quick thinking had saved his life, but he knew that Gus would never forgive this betrayal and would be looking for the first opportunity to eliminate him permanently. Subscribe with notifications if you're enjoying the videos so far. In Season 5's Tahajali, Walt nearly died in a massive shootout when Uncle Jack's neo-Nazi gang arrived to kill Jesse, trapping Walt in the middle of a gun battle between heavily armed criminals and DEA agents. Walt had been lured to the desert by Jesse and Hank's elaborate scheme involving fake photos of his buried money. After confessing to multiple crimes over the phone while racing to protect his cash, Walt realized that he had been tricked when he arrived at the burial site and found no evidence of Jesse or his money being disturbed. In his panic panic and rage, Walt had called Jack Welker's gang for backup, asking them to come kill Jesse. However, when Walt saw that Jesse was working with Hank and Gomez, he desperately tried to call off the hit, but Jack ignored his pleas and arrived anyway. The situation escalated when Jack's crew emerged from their vehicles, heavily armed with assault rifles and body armor, facing off against Hank and Gomez, who only had their service pistols. Walt found himself handcuffed in the back of Hank's SUV as both sides drew weapons, realizing that his call for help had created a war zone in the middle of the desert. When the shooting began, bullets flew in every direction as the neo-Nazis unleashed automatic weapon fires on the two DEA agents. Walt was trapped in vehicles as high-powered rounds shattered windows and punched through metal all around him. The SUV provided minimum protection against military-grade weapons, and Walt could only huddle down as the crossfire raged outside. Rounds ricocheted off rocks and vehicles while Walt remained helpless and exposed in the back seat. After the gunfire ended, Walt emerged to find Gomez dead and Hank wounded, realizing that his own desperate call for backup had resulted in the death of law enforcement officers and his own brother-in-law. The shootout he had inadvertently caused nearly killed him and destroyed what remained of his family forever. Arguably, Walt's biggest near-death experience was his cancer. Throughout Breaking Bad's 5 seasons, Walter White had waged a continuous battle against stage 3 lung cancer that served as both his initial motivation for entering the meth trade and a constant threat hanging over his criminal empire. Walt's cancer journey began on his 50th birthday when he collapsed at the A1A car wash where he worked his humiliating second job. The subsequent hospital visit revealed the devastating diagnosis: inoperable lung cancer with an estimated 2-year life expectancy. For a man who already felt marginalized and undervalued, working as an overqualified high school chemistry teacher while his former business partners built a billion-dollar empire, the cancer diagnosis represents the ultimate loss of control over his destiny. Walt initially considered refusing treatment altogether, preferring to die with dignity rather than burden his family with medical debt and the indignity of a prolonged illness. The physical and emotional toll of chemotherapy became increasingly apparent as Walt's treatment progressed. He lost his hair, suffered severe nausea, and experienced debilitating fatigue that interfered with both his teaching and his secret meth cooking operations. The side effects were so severe that Walt sometimes had to stop mid-cook to vomit or rest, creating dangerous delays in his drug operations. His appearance changed dramatically. The bald, gaunt figure that emerged bore little resemblance to the mild-mannered teacher who had received the diagnosis months earlier. Walt's most critical moment came during season 2 when his cancer appeared to be winning the battle. During the desert cook with Jesse in 4 Days Out, Walt began coughing up blood and experienced severe respiratory distress while they were stranded miles from civilization. His breathing became labored and painful, and he was convinced he was dying in the middle of nowhere. Walt became delirious and fatalistic, telling Jesse that he deserved his fate and that all his lives and criminal activity had been for nothing. The combination of desert heat, physical exertion, and his deteriorating condition brought him closer to death than any of his confrontations with drug dealers or law enforcement. Miraculously, Walt's cancer went into remission by the end of season 2, with his tumor shrinking by 80%. However, this good news created an unexpected psychological crisis. Walt had justified his criminal activity as a desperate measure to provide for his family before his death, but remission forced him to confront the reality that he might survive to face the consequences of his actions. The cancer's return in season 5 provided Walt with a final deadline, knowing that time was running out for both his criminal empire and his life, ultimately driving him to make the most desperate and destructive decisions in the series' conclusion. Walt's cancer diagnosis was ultimately responsible for every near-death experience that followed, as his decision to cook meth to secure his family's financial future before dying led him into a world of violence where he faced all constant threat from drug dealers, cartel members, and law enforcement who would have never entered his life if he had remained a simple chemistry teacher. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video about every single person Walter White killed.